Okay, let's get started here. So thank you everyone for joining us for the first ever IT Rev book club. We're featuring Team Topologies. We couldn't be more thrilled. We are doing these AMAs as a way to provide some more engagement with the authors. I hope most of you have seen, we've got an AMA channel in the Slack, and we've had people posting questions in there. So we've taken those and we're going to work with them because we think that'll fill the hour that we've got. For everyone who hasn't seen my face yet, I'm Alex Broderick Forster. I'm the Director of Brand Marketing for IT Rev. I've personally emailed every single one of you. So I'm book club admin in the channel, so you can see me there. Without taking any more time, it's really an hour, let's kick it over to Manuel.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for participating. And first of all, I have to say we really appreciate everyone joining the book club. We think it was a great idea from IT Revolution. And yeah, we really want to have feedback about the book and the ideas and what you think about it. So Alex asked me to do a short intro, so I'll try not to take too much time. I started working in IT in 2000. So I've had different roles from developer to build and release manager, QA lead, different roles until around 2010, 2011, I heard about DevOps, continuous delivery. So it made a lot of sense to me because I'd been in those silos and seen how, the gaps between teams and sometimes the processes that are put in place put people apart rather than bringing them closer together. So for the last 5-6 years, I've worked as continuous delivery and DevOps consultant, so helping different clients from different industries and sizes to improve their continuous delivery practices and DevOps. So I've worked closely with Matthew for a few years, especially in the UK, and that's where a lot of the thinking around the book came from. So clients were familiar with the DevOps Topologies, which is a site that Matthew put together, and then I helped expand. And from that, applying that in client context and seeing what worked, what didn't, our thinking also evolved into what is now the Team Topologies book.
Cool, great. Just as one quick housekeeping piece, we are going to record this session for anybody that's not able to join live, and we will share it afterwards. So the format for the rest of this is going to work like this. We've compiled all the questions. I'm going to be reading them as they were posted, and then Manuel will take care of answering the question. So let's start with the first one here. We've got a question from Jarek. So it reads, I have a question about the 4 fundamental team topologies and how it's related to smaller organizations. If you combined our dev and IT personnel at our company, it would total around 30 folks. We currently have 2 sprint teams that focus on feature dev and 1 team of 2 devs for operations work and a handful of IT folks in operations. I could see us creating a platform and subsystem team to go along with stream teams, but the value of an enabling team in our org seems questionable at the moment since we're small enough that we do a decent job of sharing and teaching each other for now. I was wondering how much value you might have seen created at other small companies that were made of 1 or 2 people, that made 1 or 2 people the enabling team, for example.
Yeah, I think that's a great question from Jarek. So does it always make sense to think about these different topologies, especially in small organizations? And I would say my first answer is at that kind of scale, it's really good if you can keep that kind of ongoing knowledge sharing between the teams in a kind of more organic way. Just part of your everyday way of working that, when you learn something, you share with the other teams because you're small enough to do that. What we have seen, and that number of 30 people is interesting because 30, 40 people, that's kind of, we've seen as the number where companies tend to work really well still and quite fast. And then when they grow from that number and they grow to 60, 70, 100, things tend to start to slow down. This is actually one of the triggers we have in chapter 8, triggers to rethink your organization, your team structures. When you feel like we're actually having more people on board, but we're going slower, we're delivering slower, that's probably a good time to rethink, how is your team structures, what are the responsibilities and the way teams interact. But going back to the question, and specifically about enabling teams that Jarek was asking about, so you don't need to have them. If it works well for you, you don't have any glaring gaps in your teams today, that's fine. You're probably better off not having an enabling team. So the fundamental patterns, the 4 topologies that we describe in the book, they apply to a wide range of organizations. But that doesn't mean that all of them need to have them. So effectively, if you have just a few highly skilled cross-functional teams, that probably works well if they just have, like I said before, this organic way of sharing knowledge and what have you. Maybe they do brown bag lunches, or just in the at the coffee or at the water cooler, they share what they've learned, or they do something a bit more intentional, but that's fine. So the enabling teams are meant when you have detected a clear gap in one or more teams, which you don't have the resources within that team and the knowledge to fulfill that gap, and it might make sense to have an enabling team. And a final note just on these enabling teams, they can also be external. They don't have to be from within your organization. So we have a case study in the book from Robin Weston when he was working at ThoughtWorks. And I think that's very telling, that case study, because they were hired by the client to help them with continuous delivery. So this was a traditional organization that existed for a long time, and they just didn't have the skills in-house, the understanding of what it means to work in a continuous delivery way. So that team intentionally did not focus on the tooling or automating tests for those people. They focus on how do we enable them, how do we get them to understand what it means, continuous delivery, and how to set the foundation so that they can then evolve by themselves. So I hope that answers the question, Jarek.
Cool. Yeah, and if you have any follow-up, we can turn that into a discussion in the discussions channel afterwards. Okay, so I'll ask the next question. Yeah?
Sure.
Okay, this is from Keith. Everywhere I've been, we've grappled with the question of how to form teams for maximum effect and struggled to find the right patterns. At my current client, we've begun to create dedicated cross-functional teams who own value streams as we've defined them. Our definition of a value stream is a part of the system that aligns with a part of the customer journey. For example, web engagement, cart and checkout, and then feature sets in the app. Think Spotify, because we deliver entertainment content. Our app lives on approximately 6 platforms, for example, Android, Chrome, iOS, etc. We're early on, so we're struggling to define the boundary between client-specific app teams, stream-aligned teams, and enabling teams. I'm sure I'll find helpful examples as I get further into the book, but I'd like to know if there are heuristics we can apply at this stage of our team creation.
Right, so that's also a very good common question that Keith asked. How do we put this different topologies in place, right? So first of all, just a note on value streams. You say that they are aligned to segments of your customer journey. So I like to see value streams that have a couple of characteristics. One is that they are mostly running independent activities from other value streams. And secondly, that they have a clear alignment to a business goal, a clear business goal, not something kind of ethereal that we want to do more business or what have you. So perhaps on that note, just think about if maybe you could do a mapping to different user personas. Would that be a better match in relation to these characteristics of independence and alignment to business goal? But going back to the topologies, so in the book we have an example from an organization in UK where one of the products, one of their systems, actually kind of complex combination of IoT. So these are hardware devices, products with IoT and with a cloud platform for data analytics, and then the mobile apps with which you can control the devices. So kind of in a similar way, they have these different technologies in place and different teams, because you cannot have one single team owning all of this together, right? That's really not possible in this case. So how do you split the teams and align them with the different parts of this kind of systems? Which one is platform? Which one is a stream team? It's obviously there's not a one straight answer. I would say be careful not to split just by technology and saying, well, we have the mobile team and we have the whatever, we have the Android team and iOS team, etc. We talk about in chapter 6 about natural fracture planes for splitting up big systems. So I'll recommend looking into that as well. The key idea is that it's not just about the architecture from a technical point of view. There are other types of fractures that might make more sense. And when you're doing that, when you're trying to think about which teams and how much should I align a team with the technology or not, try to think about other characteristics. For example, think about experiments. How easy would it be? You want to experiment with a new feature or a change in your customer journey to see if it makes life better for your users. See how you can avoid being trapped into a situation where to do one experiment, I want to try something and see if this works for my users. I'm actually going to need to involve 3, 4, 5 different teams because they're aligned to technology. Now you have to coordinate the schedule from all these different teams just to try an experiment for your users. So you don't want to get stuck in that kind of pattern. Think about change cadence. You know, how often different parts of the system are changing. And reducing dependencies between teams. For example, you might have a really good system where your API is clearly independent from the front-end systems. But does that mean that you should have a back-end team and then have different front-end teams? It depends, right? The usual answer. If you see that part of your business, you know, some of the part of the system is aligned to part of the business and is changing together frequently, so you have constantly to change both the back-end API and the mobile or whatever front end, maybe it makes sense to have one single team around that segment of business where you're going to need to have people who are good at back-end and also front-end. You know, you might have a combination. People who are more back-end but have you know, basic understanding and ability with front-end and vice versa. In the case that you have this change cycles where mostly these things change together, but if that's not the case, if they change independently, maybe that makes a lot of sense that you have an API back-end team and you have front-end teams because they are decoupled most of the time. So this is where we start to get into the team interactions part. So not only the structures, but think about the interactions that are going to happen, because you might also have something in between. Sometimes backend and frontend are changing together, and you might have 2 teams, but they need to collaborate intentionally for a period of time and say, for this feature or for this set of, you know, for this release, we need to really become almost one team and have common backlog or sorry, common schedule. And for that period of time, we are being more efficient at getting things done that need changes in both backend and front end. And then maybe later on, we can stop that close collaboration because it also has a cost you might have to tone down on other things that those teams are supposed to work on because they are investing more in that collaboration. And when you see that that's not needed anymore, or you've done the release and you move on, you can go back to an interaction mode, which is more the API team is providing it as a service, kind of, where they might be making small changes, but they're not spending most of the time doing changes that relate to this front end team. So again, just to sum up, when thinking about team structures, also think about how easy it is to do one experiment. Just think of some examples of experiments you'd like to run. Do they need to involve a lot of teams or not? What is the change cadence for different parts of the system? And how much dependencies are there between teams? And are these dependencies permanent? And maybe then you need to rethink the structure, or they are temporary and you just need to have a very clear interactions between those teams and say, for this 2 weeks or 1 month, we're going to collaborate closely, and then we're going to go back to being more decoupled, and we're evolving separately. So thinking about both team structures and team interactions is important. In the end, it's always, again, there's no perfect solution. It's always going to be a trade-off, but making these things more explicit in your thinking and how you're setting up the teams can be quite useful.
Cool, great. Okay, we've got the next question here. This is from Mike. Did you look at any other high-performing organizations and their teaming models to help shape the topologies that evolved into what we see in the book? I'm seeing some similarities between the way the military, particularly the Army, is set up into the brigade structure, combat arms, rough equivalent to the streamlined teams, being supported by the combat support units, complicated subsystems and platform teams, and combat services support, enabling teams. The cool thing is that all members of the team work towards a shared mission and aligned brigade and division level identity, while also being very individualized at the lower echelons.
Yes, we've definitely have been influenced by that, Mike. So neither of us has a military background or a lot of knowledge, but we were reading the books like Team of Teams by General Stanley McChrystal, and I find it quite funny because I would bet if you asked 10 people on the street to give an example of command and control structure, they probably would pick the Army, maybe 8 out of 10 or something. That's typically comes to mind, but in effect, it's not like that at all. As we found out through those books, I had heard about it and people told me and to look at those books, but was really revealing when we read them, and that idea of the shared mission and the focus on letting the people who are on the ground, who are closest to the battle in this case, but closest to the operations, to actually have that power to make decisions quickly. And that's a very valuable lessons, I think, for many enterprises that do work in a command and control system today. And they then are surprised by poor results, and sometimes they are looking for this silver bullet, even when we're talking about DevOps digital transformation, and they focus too much on tooling and sometimes even process when there's not, that I would say that basic need for teams to have the autonomy to decide, because they are the ones that are closest to the systems, and they should be the ones closest also to the users of their systems. So smart organizations don't care so much about whether all orders are being followed, or you need some process, and you need processes that make sense for the organization and to be followed. But the high level goal is to is focusing on outcomes and that kind of shared mission, if you like, rather than are people following the plan and the schedule, etc. That's less valuable. So yeah, definitely an inspiration from from books like that, Teams of Teams and others.
Great. Okay. Next one we got here. Another question from Jarek. Where does management fit in team topologies? I'm only about halfway through the book at the moment, but I skimmed it.
Did we jump a question from Maximilian?
Oh, sorry. Yeah, I had highlighted that one. Let me go back. Okay, Maximilian first. I have a question on team dynamics and sizes. In the book, you refer, like most of the state-of-the-art literature, to the optimal team sizes and how obviously it is not a good idea to break off performing teams or tinker around the established size. From my experience, you are sometimes in a lack of specific domain know-how, for example, IT, security, or compliance, within a team, or want to foster a new skill or characteristic by temporarily bringing in a new role. Therefore, what is your general opinion on rotating resources that temporarily join a team, for example, DevOps Team 1, to build up know-how and moving to the next team, for example, DevOps Team 2, after a fundamental structure had been built? What would be the impact on creating maybe even new unwanted communication patterns in an organization then?
It's a good question from Maximilian, and it's something that comes up often. Not just how do you foster new skills, but before that, even before thinking about that, often organizations need or they feel like they need to hire experts for all kinds of new trends, technologies, etc. Whether it's DevOps or SRE, the kind of go-to thought is to hire people to help them with that. And that's fine to some extent. What I think happens is then those organizations never build in kind of internal learning mechanisms to upskill and to evolve by themselves. They're always kind of, I call it kind of hostage of the hiring market, let's say, which is pretty hard. So especially if you're trying to hire a DevOps or SRE expert. So bringing in new people for each skill gap means you would get to very large teams. First of all, it's very hard, and secondly, you get to large teams. And in the book, when we talk about stream aligned teams or product teams, if you like, we're talking about typically 7 to 9 people. So that means we're expecting a lot of T-shaped people with, they might have more knowledge in one area, kind of more expertise, but they have kind of a baseline understanding of the different capabilities that this cross-functional team needs to do. So when you have missing skills in that team, what you can do is look at the facilitating interaction mode for teams. Of course, you need to first understand what are the gaps, and then you could have one of the fundamental topologies are enabling teams that we talked about for the first question. And in this context, maybe they make more sense. So you are actually establishing a team with the role of facilitating knowledge learning for other teams. And that has some consequences. First of all, this is also a team. This enabling team is also a stable, long-lived team normally, or at least it's not a team that you expect to be disbanding after a project or something like that. And the other consequence is that maybe you only need 2 or 3 experts, say test automation, for example, to help the other, let's say, for example, 20 to 30 teams, product teams. Maybe with that one enabling team of 2 people or 3, I'm able to help 20 or 30 teams instead of going and trying to find one test automation expert for each of those 20 to 30 teams. So you see how it makes it easier in that aspect as well. Also, the enabling team is not the only way to think about it. There are other possibilities depending on the context of your organization. So you talked about in your question about 2 different DevOps teams, if I understood correctly. and kind of sharing knowledge between them. So for example, if you have one team that is really good in, let's say, test automation, and another team is really good in infrastructure automation, maybe for a period of time, they could collaborate and work on the same backlog or on the same features for a while. And they're not only getting that work done, but they're also kind of cross-pollinating, right? They're facilitating each other to learn and to improve those skills in that other area that they are a bit behind, just by seeing what the other team is doing and pairing with them and learning on the job. So going back to the beginning, the key thing here is still focus on having stable teams, and enabling teams should also be stable, and think about what are the ways that you can improve facilitation and upskilling between teams, whether it's with an enabling or just because different teams have different knowledge at the moment. So identify what are the gaps in which teams, and then also the competences of different teams, and see what's the best way to get them together. We still think that doing a lot of rotation of people between teams is not ideal, because it breaks down the team dynamic. I hope this helped answer the question. It's not easy.
Cool, great. Hold on, we've got a response here.
So now we can go back to Jarek's question.
Yeah, just a quick response here from Maximilian. To my experience, it is a typical scenario for security experts, as the majority of experts are focused on defining policies instead of technical know-how coding skills. Now they normally join teams only to skill the developers up in terms of what they have to fulfill and fly away to the next team. It's not a real long-term solution, but lots of organizations I've seen perform that. Okay. All right, so our next question from Jarek. Where does management fit in team topologies? Only about halfway through the book at the moment, but skimmed ahead to see if that's discussed anywhere and didn't come across anything. That doesn't mean it's not there though. Also, what are some of the challenges managers transitioning to the various patterns in TT have had, and how have they addressed them?
So the answer to this question, how does management fit in team topologies? So obviously, as you pointing out, Jarek, there's a lot of changes possibly from what we suggest in team topologies that would require management to buy in and to possibly promote those changes. So I would say the answer to this is twofold. First, the book had a specific scope and length that we couldn't go over. There are many, let's say, adjacent areas when we talk about team topologies, like digital transformation, moving from project to product, teams, and just orientation in general for the enterprise or the organization. Practicing continuous delivery, focusing on operability, etc. So all these things we couldn't cover obviously in the book as well. The other aspect is what we have seen in clients. So we've mostly applied or helped apply the DevOps topologies, which are, if you like, static topologies, as we talk about in chapter 4, I believe. And the team topologies is the evolution of that. So as we were doing this work, we were seeing, different contexts and what works and what doesn't, and kind of extracting this more general view, which is not specific to DevOps, but in general, how do you get to an organization that can evolve and embrace this new trends, new technology, new markets by itself, by evolving and learning. What we have seen is in some organizations, they are a bit like we were talking before. They are stuck to an operating model ways of working that they consider like static, that's the only way to do things. So first of all, they have to realize that that doesn't match up to the current challenges in technology business. And so realizing that they need a different organization, which is not so much based on the org chart and kind of this silos and hierarchical approach. And they must realize that they need first a real transformation, which is not just about tooling or just new software. It's about actually changing the organization to become more of a learning organism and having this shared mission, autonomy for the teams, the people who are closer to the operations, etc. All those things. That realization is probably the first step. And then I would say they probably need to focus on move from project to product. To be, if you read the Team Topology book, I think underlying need to consider, focus on products and value streams even more than just products. So that requires buy-in from management. And then the Team Topologies book is not giving you specific advice on how to do that. And I understand that's not easy, but you would need that kind of buy-in from management. Also, that said, it doesn't mean that teams on their own cannot do anything. So they can start, even if you are working in a more traditional organization, a team that thinks, okay, Team Topologies makes sense for us, they can start by clarifying their own behaviors towards the outside. So we talk about team APIs in the book, for example. So just making clear to everyone around what are the ways that we expect to interact, how do we prefer to interact with others, what is our kind of API in the sense of what can you expect from us and the way we work, and what are our responsibilities. So I think that's a starting point, and you can do a lot just if teams have this awareness and this desire, even if management is not fully into this change yet. And I just saw, because I got a notification from the from Slack that someone saying that management team maybe it should be like an enabling team, and I think that probably makes sense. And at some point, like I said, these are new ideas that are in the book from what we've seen works in reality at clients. And it could be that you might have even a Team Topologies enabling team, with maybe a team that is helping others to understand Team Topologies and kind of put things into practice. That's something we might see in the future, but it's too early to tell.
Cool. All right, let's go to the next question.
Yep.
So we've got one from John here. With regards to platform teams, what do you think of Jeff Bezos' famous Amazon edict that every single team should have some amount of external customer-facing responsibility? Or in other words, are there any dangers lurking with platform teams who only have internal quote-unquote customers?
Okay, so I think John's question is about do all teams need to have a focus on the customer? And is there a difference if you are talking about internal or external customers? So I'm not sure if that memo from Jeff Bezos is the same one where he talks about having service teams with very strict boundaries, if you like, between teams, that memo was, I don't know if that was intentional or not, was in a very, I would say, brilliant way, taking advantage of Conway's law to really mirror the services at AWS with the teams, and we know that has worked quite well for them. So I don't know if it's the same memo, but I think the question is really good. I would say yes and no. Again, it depends. There is a tendency, I believe, for engineers in a platform team to perhaps care more about technology side of things, and that's fine because they need that knowledge. Except if that makes them, or at the same time they're also shy away from what you would expect from good product development team, which are things like engaging with your internal customers, understanding their needs, getting regular feedback from them, and doing your development with small interactions. Don't do big bang and then find out afterwards this was not really what was needed. So I would say in general, it's even if you're look at engineers working in external customer facing teams, it's not too easy to find people with all this way of working with this mindset, if you like. So I would say start with having good examples internally. So when you have good example, make sure that's exposed to the whole company, that other people can see, okay, this is how we want to work, how we want to mimic our interactions with clients. And also you can go back and think about your hiring process. And when in your hiring process, how do you check that people you are hiring are at least predisposed, willing to work in this way, even that has not been the way they've worked at other organizations, but at least that they're not, no, that's not something I don't want to have direct or an often frequent contact with clients, because that's a no-go. And then just I wouldn't make a big difference between platform teams and other teams. I think that kind of product development focus is hard to find. Make sure if you have good examples, they are exposed, they're appreciated by management as well, to set the example. And then whatever it is you do to make this kind of more common across the organization, perhaps you might even have a product development enabling team in a kind of with strong product people that will explain these things and help you set up communication paths with your users, and whatever you might help you. There is no reason, I think, to differentiate between platform team and external customer facing teams, because when you differentiate, then you're setting the tone that, oh, these are internal customers, we don't have to have the same standards, because that's not what you want. And we make that a big point in the book, that platform team needs to treat the platform as a product with customers, and that they need to have the same kind of good experience with the platform as your regular or external customers would have with your software. So I don't know if that was maybe a long-winded answer, but yeah, I think product development focus is very important.
Cool, that's great. Okay, we've got about 20 minutes left here.
I think we're doing good.
Yeah, we're doing great. Okay, so our next one comes from Brew. My company is about to create so-called business strategy department. It is announced but not yet formed. It will consist of product owners, quote unquote business architects, explained as people who know what our system does as a whole, know different domains and interconnections between them, and analysts who translate new laws to requirements for our system. So management is about to define who decides about what and who is responsible for what. And then the questions are, maybe you have some advice on that. What would be a big no-no and should be avoided? How should the business units be formed to best support value-creating terms? And are there any books about this? And just for everybody in book club, also open it up to, would be happy to hear from book club members about your experience.
Okay, so I'm not sure if I fully understood what this new department that's being set up is going to do. It sounds like the idea is to have separate business-focused teams from technology teams. I'm not sure if that's what you're saying, but let me give you a couple of pointers that I think might help think about this. So one key idea in the book is to the realization that what we have today are socio-technical systems. So we cannot just look at technology. We need to look at tech and people and the external world around as well. So anytime you have kind of ivory towers making decisions, even if you're saying it's a cross-business unit or team of people from different parts of the business, I think that's good, but you still need to also understand the technology part. So this is also related strongly to Conway's law. If you're making decisions about teams and who's in which team and what are the responsibilities without thinking about how does that align with the kind of systems you want to have, at the end of the day, you're going to have a mismatch. So you need collaboration between people who are designing the teams and people who are designing the systems. Or it's perhaps the same people who have this kind of broad scope, broad understanding, or you need collaboration between perhaps more business-focused people who decide on the teams and technology-focused people, architects who decide on the system architecture. But you can't decouple the two things and say we can decide about one independently from the other. And then the other thing to think about, hopefully, if you can influence this, is don't let people get fixated on a particular structure of teams. It's really important to understand that you're going to have to evolve. Even if what you decide today is what looks best, in a few months or a year, you are very likely that's not going to be the best structure again. So be prepared to evolve over time. And when I say structure, I'm also talking about team interactions. So don't expect that to be static. So instead, what you can do is, you have a structure in place. Teams are communicating. So look at those team interactions and look out for signals that maybe something is wrong. Maybe you didn't expect that these two teams would have to work together so closely for so long. So perhaps that's not the ideal situation, or the other way around. You would expect some streamlined team to work closely with the platform team because they're developing new internal services, and that's not happening. So why is that? So expect evolution, and then look at the team interactions as, look for signals on, we might need to change, and how should we change. And then the last thing is try to decouple the value streams, the business value streams. Again, I'm not sure I understood fully the question, but if you're saying you're bringing people from different business areas together, it might make it faster to change business domains, but they might be coupled. You might be coupling them more. So now you have to change things at the same time. Yes, you might understand better how to evolve the different value streams, but if you're coupling them at the same time, because all these people are in the same team or a group, that in the long run, that might not be ideal. So as I said in answer to previous question, try to have value streams that are mostly decoupled from each other. Obviously, there are points of synchronization, but that they're mostly decoupled. And then you think about the teams within the value stream. So yeah, I'm not sure how much this answered the question. And in terms of references, I would just start with the Project to Product book, which is also from IT Revolution, or any of the talks. So Mick Kirsten, who wrote the book, but also Carmen Diardo, has done really good talks around moving from project to product orientation. He did really good talks at DevOps Enterprise Summit. So if you look that up, you should be able to find it, or we can maybe post it in Slack, Alex.
Yeah, we can post some links.
Yeah, and yeah, starting there, because yeah, moving from project to product is already a big transformation. And if you don't have that awareness when you're doing this big reorganization, you know, that can also make it more difficult in the long run.
All right, great. So we go right into another question from Brew, which is, what is the worst team topology you've heard of, and what happened there?
That's a very good question. I got to be careful here.
Yeah.
I think it would be fun if people shared their, I'm sure everyone has their own worst topology in their head. If people shared it in Slack, that would be great.
Start a discussion for it.
Yeah. And so I think one common thing, let's say, is when you look at team structures that actually, or topology that kind of makes sense, but then the team interactions are very awkward or very slow. Like if you have an infrastructure team that takes days to open a port on a machine, that's really, you know, you can't go at a decent speed of delivery when you have things like that. So those are probably the most common. In terms of structures, of team structures, we had one client who is a provider for a telecom, for a large telecom. And this is actually not that rare situation. So they do both project development for new software and tools, and they also do the maintenance of the service, so running those tools or software. So one thing I noticed there is, so they have different different contracts. So they'll have temporary contracts for project development with typically 3 to 6 months, something like that, and then they have contracts related to the same software, but the maintenance and the service is a long-running 3 to 5 year contract, for example. And to me, that struck me like it reminded me of Conway's Law, but instead of the teams mirroring the architecture, the software architecture, in this case, those teams are mirroring the contracts and that structure. So what you had there, where you had temporary project teams that you would disband at the end of a project, leave maybe one person behind to kind of do the handoff to this new maintenance team or existing maintenance team that would take over this new project outcome. And the people who were in the project team would get shuffled to another project, and the maintenance team would be in charge of small fixes, making sure the service runs correctly. And as you can imagine, this led to all kinds of wrong incentives. First of all, you lose all the knowledge that the project team had gathered. No matter how much handoff you do, it's never going to be the same as the team who worked on it for 6 months or so. The project team has no incentive to focus on quality and operability because they're not going to be there to handle the problems afterwards. And the support or maintenance team also has an incentive to reject requests from clients and just say, well, that's a new project. That's not my responsibility. So all kinds of unwanted behaviors because of this setup that was caused by the contract structure. So that was probably one of the worst, all kinds of anti-patterns that you can see there compared to what we recommend in the book. And another example I've seen recently, just to give you an idea, so it's a very siloed organization to the point where developers were not allowed to merge into master branches. So another team had that kind of ownership, a team that did not do the development. So these kind of things you see quite often, and they lead to teams not having that kind of end-to-end ownership that we recommend in the book, and that we have seen that is what makes for really high-performing teams. Because we often talk, or we hear talk about DevOps and digital transformation, but when you start talking about removing teams that are silos, things get often complicated. I had also a personal experience before I was doing consulting, where I was head of QA team, and they were working in a very waterfall way. And although they were calling themselves agile, but they had a QA team that had to do all the verification at the end of projects. So we said, no, that doesn't work very well. We moved QA engineers inside the development teams to get them to be more cross-functional and fix problems faster and identify problems much faster. And at the point where we had that working well, I told my boss that my team wasn't needed anymore. So he looked a bit puzzled at me. I said we can do with a community of practice around QA or a guild in Spotify terms, but that wasn't accepted because there was the feeling that they needed to keep the hierarchy and the organizational chart. So yeah, that also relates to that previous question about management. If you still don't have that realization that the org chart by itself narrow or very specific responsibilities is typically not going to be conducive to high performing teams. So because in the end, when we talk about team topologies, that's also what we want to get to, right? So what are some patterns that can help us get to high performing teams and product or streamlined teams that can go really fast but safe as well, and they have the support system with other types of topologies, with the platform enabling and the complicated subsystem. So yeah, but I would love to hear other stories from people in the book club.
Great. Yeah, so post any of those into the discussions channel. So we have a few more questions left. We're almost at time here. Do you want to try to we'll just do them in order, and when we have to stop, we'll stop? Do you want to try to rapid fire them? What do you think would be best for the last couple we got here? Or do you want to follow up?
Why don't I try to rapid fire them?
Okay.
And then just go a bit faster.
Okay.
So maybe I'll just read the questions because
sure.
there are a few short ones. So Ivan Bula was asking about when the team is a delivery bottleneck, how do you know if it's cognitive load problem or a result of bad estimation planning practices? I would say even the way to answer that is that you can have a team delivering without bottlenecks at a consistent rate, and that team might still have too much cognitive load, because the way that might manifest is later on with, for example, issues with parts of the system that the team doesn't understand because they haven't had the mental space to really own that part of the system, but they are responsible. And so if that fails in production, it's going to be very painful, very hard to fix, possibly. So I would say those are two different things. You might have a steady delivery and you still have too much cognitive load. Carl Metivier, he was asking about that Agile and DevOps suggest teams should be cross-functional, have multiple skills. And so we probably want to have people become T-shaped rather than experts in one area. How do we balance that with cognitive overload? So I think this is related to the previous question, and the fact is that reducing cognitive load does not mean that you restrict the person to only be responsible for one skill or a small set of skills to be an expert. That's not what we're trying to say. We agree with Agile and DevOps. In fact, when we talk about stream-aligned teams, that's exactly the kind of teams that you are talking about with T-shaped people. What happens is that, especially with those large organizations, or even organizations that go beyond 30, 40, 50 people, it becomes too much for one single team to own all the skills if they were to do their work from scratch without any help. So they need a support system around them. They need that platform to give them access to internal services, all kinds of things that they might need. Can be monitoring, infrastructure automation, all these things, enabling teams to help them upskill and gather knowledge, gain knowledge where they have gaps. So the stream-aligned teams are the teams that you're talking about, and then the other types of teams are there to reduce the cognitive load by providing internal services, by helping them gain new skills faster with a smaller learning curve, and that's all to reduce the cognitive load. So the cognitive load is having too much in your working memory, which is not focused on the business, on what you're actually trying to achieve from a business standpoint. JT was asking if there's a core definition of team, if it's pod or two-pizza team. One issue that we face is team can be considered from 8 people to 80 people. So when you try to discuss concepts of cognitive capacity, it gets lost, as they cannot imagine that 80 people don't have cannot comprehend something. Later on, you cover monoliths and coupling, and I evidence that these things have been created and not seen as a problem because the concept of team was huge or was not clear. Yeah, so for us, a team is a unit of 7 to 9 people, so that 2 pizza team on average. Although we've seen smaller teams work quite well. So we've seen, and there's a case study or example in the book where you might even have a well-performing team of 7 to 9 people, and they've broken down into smaller teams to be able to reduce the cognitive load, and they were able to go even faster. So just a side note, it can be even smaller, but on average, we're talking 7 to 9 people, or 7 plus minus 2, and a stable team that is composed by mostly T-shaped people. You might have some experts, but the important thing is that we're looking at the team as having those capabilities that are needed for end-to-end ownership of a service or product. And then that team should be long-lived. Doesn't mean there can't be any changes, but you are not disbanding the team or recreating, as I was saying in that example around the telecom provider. That is not, then you don't have a team. You have a temporary group of people who have not gelled yet, who have not become a high-performing team. So yeah, and I would recommend, related to this question, we talk about Dunbar's number. So look at that in the book and also online, because you will see how there are different sizes of groupings which have an influence on the kind of trust level you can have within that group. So there are some very interesting examples. For example, look at Gore-Tex company, and not the company, they make the Gore-Tex material. If you look that up and you look at Malcolm Gladwell Tipping Point book, it talks about that. So we're running out of time, but that's very interesting. What is the right size of groups of people so that you have certain behaviors and certain levels of trust.
Great.
Are we running out of time, Alex?
If you want to go longer and do any others, I know that you had a time constraint, so we can wrap it now and we can continue answering questions tomorrow. Or if you feel like you have more time to answer a few, you're more than welcome to.
Well, there were a couple of questions that came in a bit later. but I'm happy to try to answer quickly.
Sure.
So the most surprising thing we've learned while writing this book, yields and groupers don't count. So that shows if you've read the book or part of the book. So yields and groupers is a great example of, but there are others in nature around how, ecosystems in nature, for example, how trees are connected by roots and they kind of have these systems that help each other grow. And for me, that was something I hadn't digged into before, and this realization that actually there are all these systems in nature that already are considering the collaboration between different species, different groups for a greater good, if you like. That was really something I learned and was really interesting. Also the army examples that I've talked about before, I got more in depth into that. And yeah, also another thing I remember is, so we talk about swarming in support and changing at the end of the book, changing the typical 3-tier support system. So I saw a really good talk by John Hall, this DevOps Enterprise Summit in London. So that's online, so look that up. John Hall about swarming in support teams. That was really good as well. And the last question, what were the key thoughts crystallized in the process of writing the book? So the team topologies are based on our experience consulting and discussion of ideas between us. And the great thing was that when we were looking for case studies, we realized how the discussions we had and the thoughts we had were reflected in those case studies that we were looking at. So when we talk about the 4 team types and fundamental team types and the 3 interaction modes in the book, that might seem a bit bold, let's put it like that, to say that this is all you need. But when we looked at the case studies, there wasn't a case where it said, actually, this is totally different way of setting up and interacting teams that we didn't think about. Perhaps that will come, and we welcome that. It's not like this is the final say around this, obviously, but we were just happy to see that the case studies and people we talked with, we could map what they were doing to, the topologies, which really are meant just to be guiding guidelines to then apply in your own context. Obviously, it's not it's prescriptive to a certain point, but not to say we just copy this and apply. Obviously, there's a lot of contextualization that needs to be done and thinking about how does this topologies interaction modes apply in my organization. And that's what I had as questions, Alex.
Okay, great. Yeah, if there are any follow-up questions or ones that we missed here, just ping us on Slack and we'll make sure to get them in for tomorrow or a future one. Big thank you, Manuel, for making the time to come on here and answer all these questions and really kickstart book club.
A lot of talking, but I hope it was useful. And yeah, I'm happy to follow up. Matthew, I'm sure we'll be happy to follow up on some questions, or we can do on Slack. That's fine as well.
And just as a reminder, everyone, we've got another AMA tomorrow. We'll have Matthew. It is from 12:30 to 1 p.m., so half hour Pacific time as well. I will post a link in the AMA channel, and I'll probably ping everybody everywhere about it, just so you all have that handy. And yeah, let's start discussions. We'll post some questions into the discussions channel, and let's kick things off with chapter 1, the preface and the foreword. So thank you again. I'll post this recording, and welcome to book club.
Thank you. Bye-bye.